In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. Nazi bombers filled the skies, launching relentless attacks in what felt like the end of hope. A small group of British pilots took to the air to defend their homeland, and at the heart of their fight was a machine many thought would never fly. It was an engine that almost destroyed its creators, took lives in testing, and nearly bankrupted one of the greatest engineering firms in history. Yet this very engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, became the heartbeat of victory. This is the little-known saga of how a flawed creation became the backbone of salvation. This is the story of the Merlin. The story begins in 1933, tucked away in the quiet town of Derby, England. At a time when global conflict seemed a distant nightmare, a handful of visionary engineers were working under dim lights in secret, driven not by orders from above, but by sheer ambition. The wounds of the First World War were still fresh, and peace felt permanent. But within Rolls-Royce's factory walls, a quiet revolution had already begun. Henry Royce, one of the founding legends of the company, had passed away just a few years earlier. Still, his pursuit of mechanical perfection echoed through every corridor, haunting every sketch and sleepless night. What they were building wasn't just an engine, it was an obsession wrapped in metal, designated simply as PV12, short for Private Venture 12. There were no big contracts or promises of fame, just a dangerous dream of creating something that could outfly, outfight, and outlast any engine on Earth. What set the Merlin apart wasn't just its size or its impressive numbers. It was a masterclass in design philosophy, a liquid-cooled V12 engine with a displacement of 27 liters and architecture that bordered on art. 12 cylinders were carefully positioned in a 60-degree V, working together in perfect mechanical harmony. This wasn't an engine in the traditional sense. It was a performance, a mechanical symphony where each piston, valve, and crankshaft played its part with surgical precision. And then there was the supercharger, a revolutionary piece of engineering that allowed the Merlin to deliver fierce power even in the thinning air high above the clouds. At sea level, it pumped out 1,030 horsepower. Even at 16,000 feet, it roared like thunder. But hidden beneath its gleaming surface was a nightmare no one wanted to face. The early versions of the Merlin weren't heroic. They were horrifying. Test after test ended in disaster. Engines overheated, bearings seized, connecting rods snapped. The glycol-based coolant systems boiled over mid-flight. Pilots would report sudden violent failures, warning lights blinking seconds before catastrophic engine seizures. One moment the plane was humming through the sky, the next it was a dead weight spiraling toward the ground. These failures didn't just damage machines, they took lives. Brave pilots who trusted this engine paid the price in fire and wreckage. Behind the scenes, Rolls-Royce engineers were pushed to the brink. They worked day and night, revising designs, experimenting with alloys, overhauling cooling systems, and literally bleeding for every breakthrough. Time was slipping away, and the world was inching toward war. By the late 1930s, panic had set in. War was now inevitable. Hitler's military might was growing at a terrifying pace. And the Merlin, the very engine that was meant to protect Britain's skies, still couldn't be trusted. Engineers knew they had no choice. Either they fixed the Merlin or watched their nation fall. Miraculously, their desperation birthed innovation. Advanced metalworking techniques solved the engine's weakest points. A new cooling system was devised. Lubrication problems were tackled with fresh chemical formulas. And slowly, piece by piece, the beast began to cooperate. By 1939, with war erupting across Europe, the Merlin was finally ready. Not flawless, but battle-hardened and reliable enough to meet the challenge ahead. Then came the moment that would define a generation, the Battle of Britain. In the skies over London and the English Channel, swarms of German bombers and fighters stormed across the horizon, determined to break British resistance. What stood against them were the Spitfires and Hurricanes, agile, defiant, and powered by the Merlin's furious growl. As air raid sirens wailed and civilians watched from underground shelters, the fate of freedom soared on wings carved by Rolls-Royce. On September 15th, now remembered as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched its most brutal assault. But what met them was not silence. It was the thunder of 1,030 horsepower rising from the earth to protect its people. That day, Britain did not fall. That day, the Merlin proved it wasn't just a machine. It was a force that shifted the course of history. But the Merlins War didn't end with the Spitfire. Far from it. This engine became the power behind some of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built. Machines that shaped the outcome of World War II in secret and spectacular ways. One such marvel was the de Havilland Mosquito, a light, wooden aircraft so fast and versatile it left enemy pilots stunned. Twin Merlin engines gave it the speed of a fighter and the punch of a bomber, all while evading radar detection. Then came the Avro Lancaster, a heavy bomber with 4 Merlins under its wings. It could carry 22,000 pounds of bombs deep into Nazi territory, delivering destruction to the very heart of Hitler's war machine. And perhaps most legendary of all, the P-51 Mustang. Originally an American fighter with decent performance, it was transformed when fitted with the Merlin. Suddenly it had the range, speed, and altitude capabilities to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, changing the air war over Europe forever. The Rolls-Royce Merlin wasn't just an engine. It was a miracle forged in crisis, refined in tragedy, and unleashed in the fight for freedom. It carried our hopes into battle and came roaring back, scarred but victorious. And though the war is over, the story of the Merlin still echoes, a reminder that even in our darkest hour, human brilliance can create something powerful enough to turn thunder into triumph.
As the war escalated, Britain found itself staring down a grim reality. The demand for Merlin engines was soaring beyond what its factories could ever hope to meet. The Royal Air Force needed thousands of them, but Rolls-Royce was only capable of producing a fraction. German U-boats were choking supply routes, and constant bombing raids crippled British manufacturing. It was a crisis with no clear solution until a bold and risky decision was made. Britain would share its most prized engineering secret with a foreign company. That company was the Packard Motor Car Company in the United States. Every blueprint, every hard-earned discovery, every closely guarded technique was handed over, not stolen, but offered, in what could be called reverse-engineered espionage. It was a desperate act of trust between allies, betting that American industrial power could succeed where British capacity fell short. But the gamble wasn't without its complications. When British engineers arrived in Detroit with their sacred blueprints in hand, they were met with an unexpected obstacle. Every detail in their designs used fractional inches, while American factories operated using thousandths, a seemingly small difference, but one that introduced massive errors in precision. Every tolerance, every clearance had to be reinterpreted, recalculated, and reconciled. What followed was more than just a manufacturing challenge. It was a cultural collision. On one side stood British engineers, masters of handcrafted precision, proud of traditions rooted in centuries of fine craftsmanship. On the other were American workers, shaped by the mass production revolution, believers in uniform output at scale. The friction between those philosophies nearly brought the project to its knees. But instead of abandoning the effort, both sides adapted. British designers began to share insights they'd previously protected fiercely. American workers, in turn, opened their minds to new standards of precision and care. Slowly, a powerful synergy took shape. Metallurgy improved. Assembly line innovation streamlined production. Quality control systems were installed to detect flaws before engines left the factory floor. In the end, the Packard-built Merlin engines became even more refined than the originals. More than 55,000 of them were produced in the US, far surpassing the number built in Britain. These engines went on to power the P-51 Mustang, giving Allied bombers long-range protection and helping tip the air war decisively in the Allies' favor. When the war ended and silence returned to the skies, the Merlin faced what should have been its final chapter. Jet propulsion had arrived, the world was turning its eyes to the future, and piston-driven engines were quickly being seen as relics of a bygone era. The Merlin, despite all its triumphs, seemed destined for retirement. But fate had one more role for this mechanical marvel. In the post-war world, the Merlin found new life in civil aviation. Aircraft once used in war were adapted for commercial use. And to everyone's surprise, the Merlin-powered planes performed better than expected. They were fast, reliable, and efficient, making them ideal for passenger and cargo transport. The Avro York, built on the back of wartime innovation, became a cornerstone of British aviation. But perhaps the most unexpected legacy of the Merlin emerged not in the skies of war, but in the world of sport. Surplus engines found their way into high-performance racing aircraft. Modified and fine-tuned, they roared across the skies at air races, reaching speeds that defied belief. These machines became a symbol, not of destruction, but of ingenuity and passion. Even now, nearly 80 decades since the Merlin first fired to life, restored aircraft fitted with these engines continue to fly. Air shows around the world still echo with the deep, growling thunder of a sound once associated with salvation and sacrifice. But beyond the mechanical legacy, the Merlin left us something far more important, a lesson about the human spirit. When we look back on the story of this engine, we're not just studying a piece of hardware, we're examining our own potential under pressure. The Merlin wasn't just forged in factories, it was born from sleepless nights, impossible deadlines, and the sheer will of engineers who knew failure was not an option. These men and women pushed boundaries not for profit or glory, but because their world was in danger. They worked through exhaustion, overcoming setbacks that would have crushed lesser teams. The pilots who flew with the Merlin beneath their wings accepted every risk, knowing that a failure at 20,000 feet could mean death. But they trusted it, and they trusted those who built it. Together, they created not just a machine, but a movement. In the end, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine became more than an engine. It became a symbol of resilience, of collaboration, and of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It taught us that even in the darkest hours, human innovation can break through, that when ordinary people are faced with extraordinary challenges, they can rise to meet them and do the impossible. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible untold moments from history. What other great achievements would you like to explore next? Share your thoughts in the comments and keep the spirit of the Merlin alive.